Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, today we're diving into what is undoubtedly one of the darkest, most devastating chapters in all of human history, the historical roots of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And yeah, it's a really heavy topic. But understanding the exact step-by-step mechanisms of how this actually happened, that is absolutely crucial for all of us right now. We aren't just looking at the what, we're digging into the systemic processes that allowed the what to happen in the first place. And that brings us to the big central question framing our entire discussion today. How exactly does an advanced society descend into industrial-scale genocide? I mean, it's a terrifying question, right? Because the Holocaust wasn't just some sudden, random explosion of violence out of nowhere. Not at all. It was a deeply structural, deeply sociological descent. Let's break down exactly how that descent played out.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the roots of anti-Semitism. Second, the 10 stages of genocide. Third, we'll look at the scale of the destruction. Fourth, naming the unspeakable. And finally, remembrance and modern denial. Let's get right into it.
Part 1, the roots of anti-Semitism. Because it is so vital to understand that the unimaginable tragedies of the 1930s and 40s, they did not just happen in a vacuum.
The absolutely crucial concept we need to grasp here is fertile soil. When Adolf Hitler took power in Germany back in January 1933, he didn't have to invent hatred. The groundwork was already there. We are talking about at least 18 centuries of deeply rooted anti-Semitism across Europe, fueled by religious prejudice and constant economic scapegoating. And alongside that, hundreds of years of systemic persecution against the Roma and Sinti people. This prejudice was essentially just baked into everyday social norms. So when these racist policies were introduced, they didn't really meet much resistance. This long, heavily documented history basically provided the fertile soil that allowed everyday individual citizens to become indifferent bystanders, or worse, active collaborators in the evil that was unfolding right in front of them.
So how does that pre-existing everyday prejudice actually get weaponized by a government? Well, that brings us to part 2, the 10 stages of genocide. This sociological framework brilliantly illustrates the architecture of atrocities. The 10 stages of genocide show us that this is a long, deliberate process. It all starts with stigmatization, basically focusing negative emotions on people's differences and stripping away their humanity. And once you do that, it opens the door for the next crucial step, legal discrimination, making it the law to treat them differently. From there, it escalates to state-sponsored mass murder, where local communities who have already been whipped up by relentless propaganda either join in or just stand by. And finally, the ultimate stage is denial. That's where the perpetrators try to literally erase any evidence of their crimes. It is a chillingly methodical, step-by-step process.
And you can see just how rapidly this horrific architecture was built in the 1930s. In 1933, the Nuremberg race laws were passed, which initially targeted about 500,000 assimilated Jews and around 60,000 Roma and Sinti people. Then jump to November 1938, and this legal discrimination violently erupts into the Night of the Broken Glass, a massive, terrifying pogrom across Germany and Austria. By 1939, victims are being actively forced from their homes into overcrowded, disease-ridden ghettos. And by 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the whole timeline just accelerates, moving directly into the systematic implementation of the so-called final solution.
You see, the Nazi obsession with racial purity and Aryan superiority expanded brutally and quickly. While they were aiming for the complete physical and cultural annihilation of the Jewish people, the regime also swept up anyone, literally anyone they considered a detriment to their twisted moral or physical standards. Think about this. Between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma and Sinti were murdered. Nearly 300,000 people with mental and physical disabilities were systematically killed in what they called the Action T4 program. Political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, they were all targeted, imprisoned, and murdered too. The net of their persecution was incredibly vast and totalizing. And to truly wrap your head around the absolute fanaticism of this regime, consider this one staggering, chilling detail from the historical record. The Nazi obsession with exterminating Jews reached such an absurd level that they literally sent a boat to the remote Greek island of Leros for one reason, just to capture and deport its single, solitary Jewish resident to Auschwitz. It's almost hard to fathom, right? But it perfectly highlights the inescapable, totalizing nature of their genocidal obsession. They left no stone unturned. Which leads us directly into our third section, the scale of destruction, because we have to look at the devastating, completely unprecedented results of this systemic persecution.
66%, two-thirds of Europe's entire Jewish population was exterminated by the Nazis and their collaborators. We're talking about roughly 6 million people murdered. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a targeted industrial-scale massacre explicitly aimed at wiping out an entire people and their culture, looting their property, burning down their synagogues, and destroying their sacred texts along the way. And the demographic scar this left on the continent? It's permanent. Look at this. Before the outbreak of World War II, Jews accounted for up to 2.4% of Europe's total population. Today, they make up just 0.2%. These vibrant communities that had been there for centuries were practically erased overnight, leaving a massive void in the cultural and demographic fabric of Europe that, honestly, remains to this day.
Moving on to our fourth section, naming the unspeakable. Because when an event happens on such an unprecedented, world-shattering scale, how do you even begin to name it?
The language we use is incredibly important here. Early on, and among themselves during the war, Jewish victims often referred to the catastrophe using the biblical Hebrew word herban, or its Yiddish version, herben. This literally translates to destroy. Now, historically, this specific term referred to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple. So by using herban, they were essentially trying to place the Nazis' extermination policy into the long, biblical context of the historical catastrophes that the Jewish people had previously faced.
But then, by the 1960s, a major shift occurred in how people talked about it. Many secular Jews actually wanted to distance the event from that context of biblical martyrdom. They recognized the totally unique, modern, industrial scale of this specific massacre. So they adopted the Hebrew term Shoah, which translates to waste and desolation. This term got popularized heavily by Claude Lanzmann's incredible 1985 documentary film of the same name. And today, Shoah is widely used, especially in France and Israel, to really emphasize the specific uniqueness of this tragedy.
We also absolutely must acknowledge how the Roma and Sinti people named their specific tragedy. They used two highly evocative terms. The first is Samudarapen. That's a Romani neologism meaning murder of all or mass murder, which really conveys a deep, respectful grief. The other term is Porridgemose, which translates to destruction or devouring. And that word is incredibly emotionally charged. It specifically highlights the deliberate, devouring intent to murder on the part of the Nazis.
An overgrown, old Jewish cemetery, hidden away in the woods, it stands as a silent witness to a completely destroyed heritage. Deciding exactly how to name these atrocities, it's about so much more than just words. It's about collective memory. It is about permanently fixing these events into our minds so that we fully understand the heavy burden and the required acts of remembrance today.
And that profound need for collective memory brings us to our fifth and final section, remembrance and modern denial. Because, quite frankly, the fight to preserve the truth of this history is far from over.
Today, we're actually seeing a really disturbing rise in two distinct but related threats. The first is Holocaust denial. This is the attempt to completely erase the history in order to legitimize anti-Semitism. But the second threat is Holocaust distortion, and this one is arguably more insidious. Distortion acknowledges that the Holocaust happened, sure, but it intentionally excuses, minimizes, or misrepresents the facts. Both of these tactics are currently on the rise, and they're being massively amplified by digital technologies, AI chatbots, deepfakes, and political propaganda coming from both extremes of the political spectrum.
And hey, if you're thinking, well, surely modern Holocaust education has solved this, wait until you hear this statistic from a recent EU strategy report. It is incredibly alarming. 5% of EU citizens have never even heard of the Holocaust. Never heard of it. And almost 70% remain completely ignorant about Jewish history and religion. So that centuries-old fertile soil of prejudice we talked about earlier, it hasn't entirely disappeared. Not at all. The final stage of genocide, forgetting and denial, is an active, very present-day threat.
So, I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. If the final stage of genocide is denial, what is your role in protecting the truth of the past? Today, we've traced how centuries of prejudice laid the groundwork for an industrial-scale catastrophe. And we've seen just how fragile historical truth can be. Understanding all of this, it isn't just about memorizing history. It is about ensuring that the phrase "never again" actually remains a reality. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today.